Hello, I'm Amelia Newcomb, Managing Editor of the Christian Science Monitor, and I'm very happy to welcome you here to this special live event on climate change. So over the next half hour or so, we'll be sharing a different perspective on a subject that's often reported with grim details and foreboding. But that's not what our team found. Our reporters and photographers traveled all over the world in 2023, from the deserts of Namibia to the ice of the Arctic Ocean. Barbados, Bangladesh, these are locales that you don't see a lot of reporting from, but they are on the front lines of climate change. And the Monitor discovered young people everywhere who have been shaping a new mindset, one that is about finding solutions to the climate crisis. We named them the Climate Generation, those people born since 1989 and the first to grow up with climate change as an ever-present challenge. I'm going to introduce the Monitor journalists who worked on this series in just a moment. But first, I'd like to thank the Pulitzer Center for its support of this project. And let's make sure you know how to find the project on our website. You can point your web browser to csmonitor.com/climate generation, and you'll hit the landing page with a gateway to all 7 of our major features, as well as engaging audio and video. Later in the program, I'll also tell you about a special free trial subscription to the Christian Science Monitor Daily. Now, let me make some introductions. Clara Germani is our series editor for the Climate Generation. Clara will anchor the discussions tonight with the correspondents. Stephanie Haynes is our environmental reporter. Sarah Miller-Llana is our Canada bureau chief. And Melanie Stetson Freeman is a staff photographer. So I'll kick things off by asking you a question, Clara. What prompted the team to narrow the focus of this series to this particular group of people?
Well, as you just mentioned, we're talking about the first generation to grow up with global warming. We defined the group as those born since 1989 because that was when the United Nations codified children's rights to a safe life and secure future. And at the same time, it was when changing temperatures started to register on global consciousness. So now, 30-some years later, we have this paradox of a generation that has experienced unprecedented advances in quality of life while seeing that progress threatened by a changing, heating, disrupted world. To be sure, we found evidence of eco-anxiety, but our reporting found something more. A generation experiencing a mindset revolution, surviving by pushing back with an ethos about consumption, with a new ethos about consumption, progress, and what it means to live a good life. In a sense, climate change, like the Industrial Revolution, is creating new conceptions of progress, time, responsibility, and work. So I'd start by asking Sara to tell us where the seed of the project came from.
Sure. Well, this project actually goes back about 30 years. I was on assignment with Mel in Bolivia, and she told me about a project she did in 1987 called Children in Darkness. And that actually came before the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Christian Science Monitor traveled all over the world. She shot photos in Thailand, Iraq, Peru, looking at children soldiers, prostitutes, and laborers. And that work was so powerful to me. I always wanted to pick it up, but I moved to 2 new countries. I had a baby. It just didn't really happen until last year. And so I really started with a blank slate. It was children in the world. I had this stack of economists right next to me, and I started pulling out any story that had to do with children. And then I asked, thankfully, Stephanie to join forces. And the 2 of us very quickly identified climate as the challenge of the generation. But as Clara said, even though that threatens to roll back rights, in some ways, those rights have really poised children to face the challenge of their generation. And that, to me, was crystal clear in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, children are at, if you look at where children are most at risk and climate, they're actually the most vulnerable in the world. And yet they're on the front lines of adaptation. And to us, that is the climate generation.
Okay. So with generous funding from the Pulitzer Center, we were able to go anywhere in the world. So I'll ask Stephanie to explain how we decided where in the world to go.
Yeah, like you said, we really could have gone anywhere because climate change is everywhere. And so when Sara and I started talking about how we wanted to tell this story, we knew that we wanted to go to different countries that would reflect different parts of the climate challenge. So we knew that we wanted to go to the Arctic, that's warming faster than anywhere else in the world. And we knew, like she said, Bangladesh was going to be important because it was a place that was notoriously struggling with sea level rise. We wanted to do a story from the US because cumulatively, the United States is the largest emitter in the world. And we wanted to see what was happening here. We knew we wanted to go to a small island nation state, so we ended up in Barbados, which also has a big role in reimagining how the world is going to finance climate adaptation and resilience. And so we just went through different countries and really thought carefully about what we might be able to show there. And of course, hope that we could find the right people to do so.
Yeah. Well, our first story, which ran in the November 6th Monitor, was a really thorough overview of our findings after we'd traveled to all these places, after you'd traveled to all these places. And then we followed every week for 6 weeks with a focus on individuals. Sara, will you explain how these anecdotal cases actually fit into the findings of our larger story?
Sure. I mean, one of our major findings was that this generation does not look at climate change as something that belongs in a box or that belongs in a silo. They really see it as part of everything in their lives and that everything's interconnected. So Mel and I were in the Arctic and we met these indigenous conservationists who were talking about conserving their land and maintaining ice levels to protect their wildlife, caribou, polar bears, whales, and that in turn could perhaps draw tourists and create this sort of circular economy. And we traveled to the Arctic. I wrote my first draft of the story. I flew to Namibia. I got, some playback from Clara, who's a very tough editor. And, that afternoon I went and I was talking to this guy in Namibia who was talking about the desert ecosystem and preserving that to protect their wildlife, in this case, elephants and rhinos, to create sustainable tourism, to create this circular economy. And I had this aha moment, like, oh my God, this is a completely different context, ice and desert, but they're totally echoing one another.
Stephanie, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that, or?
I just had a similar experience. I mean, I was reporting a story that was going to look at food systems and the way that young people were reimagining food in the face of climate change. And that was going to be focused in Europe. And before I traveled to Portugal, I ended up reporting in Barbados and across the island saw similar efforts to the ones that I had been reporting about in Portugal. So the same thing that Sara found, there were really these trends that made us realize we were looking at a generational shift as opposed to just individual stories.
Yeah. And I have to say, in all of this, there was so much rich material that you got that could never possibly fit into the 7 stories. I mean, maybe there's a book in it somewhere. And so much was left on the cutting room floor. I'd like it if each one of you could just briefly tell us one quick impression of someone who will always be with you from the cast of characters you encountered and why. Maybe Melanie can start.
Sure. I guess for me, it's 3 best girlfriends in Bangladesh. We first met Mafia at her secondary school in a little town on the Delta. And we followed her home after school down a narrow dirt road to her home and met her family, and they washed in the pond right by their house. And then we followed her to her after-school program. It's a club where we met her 2 best friends. So the 3 of them, Mafia, Sanjita, and Muntarin, we'll never forget. The club teaches them about issues in their lives, but also climate change adaptation. We watched them singing and dancing to Dollywood music, and we loved their intelligence, their beauty, and their positive energy. They want to stay in school so they don't get married off young. 2 of them want to be doctors, and 1 wants to be a nurse.
Sara?
For me, the guy I'm never going to forget is Dion. He was the subject of a profile that we did from Namibia, and I probably interviewed Dion for about 30 hours, which is far more than a normal interview. I spent days with him in Windhoek, the capital of Namibia. I saw him take calls from the US Embassy, from the UN Development Program. I witnessed him mentoring young people in a coffee shop. And I knew that he was doing all of this without money. But it wasn't until we gained his trust and he invited us into his home that I really understood the kind of sacrifice he's making, how much he's giving with so little in return. He lives in a basement room with his mother. I mean, he doesn't even have a bed. He doesn't even have a mattress. And all around him on the floor, his climate policy documents and all the badges that he's gotten from traveling to COPs around the world. And that image will always stick with me. And it just, to me, it just tells us everything.
I think for me, the person, there's so many people that I interviewed that I will remember, but one little quick exchange that I had with one of the young people who were involved in a children's climate lawsuit in Montana. It's a girl named Grace, and she was so articulate and so thoughtful about these big questions of constitutional law and human rights and children's rights. And when I explained to her what we were doing about writing about this climate generation born since 1989, she just looked at me and grinned and said, "Oh, you're writing about the Swifties." And it was just this moment. She's talking about Taylor Swift, who was born in 1989. And it was just this moment that these are kids, and they're really balancing these big issues, and they're also joyfully young. And that both and really stuck with me as I reported.
Yeah. And I just have to add here that Stephanie, when they won the lawsuit in Montana, sent a text to Clara and me, "The kids won." So just showed how excited she was for them.
Yeah. I just want to note that you can hear these kids that they talked about, as well as a lot of others that they interviewed on the landing page called. You can go there by typing in csmonitor.com/climate generation, where there's an interactive map, and you can click on each face and hear them telling a little bit about themselves. There may be those who might think that these are all great stories of small steps that lead to solutions for climate change, but are these just isolated dots on the map? How will they really move the dial on carbon reduction? Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about climate change is that it's just an everything issue. All parts of life, everywhere in the world are affected by climate change. And so talking to these young people, yeah, there's some who have their own small solutions, but what we're finding is that there is this large mindset shift. So even individuals, as they change the way that they're thinking, as they start imagining a different future, all of those things go together to make technological or policy or political changes or scientific innovation changes that do end up shifting these big picture changes and creating these big picture changes to address climate change. So yes, these were all individual stories, but they were reflective of a really large cultural movement.
Yeah. When we talk about climate activism and young people, it's really easy to think about Greta Thunberg in Sweden sounding the alarm. But I was surprised to hear that, for example, just across the Arctic from Sweden, there were young Canadian Indigenous conservationists who'd never even heard of her. if this generation speaks the same language and the language of the same sentiment, what is it?
Well, I think one of the words that we heard over and over and over again in our reporting, both Stephanie and myself around the world, was the word opportunity. So one of the biggest challenges that the Inuit face in the Arctic is the erasure of their culture by the Canadian government historically. But now the Canadian government is looking at their Indigenous practices as a solution to one of the greatest challenges Canada faces, which is climate change. So they're paying Indigenous guardians across the country to use their old practices to be part of the solution. In one of, the case in the Arctic, it's to help preserve biodiversity, 30% of it by 2030. In Namibia, Dion actually used those literal words. We were with him. He was giving a class on renewable energy, and he was trying to get these kids excited about it. And he was talking about jobs they can have in wind and solar, and ways to create companies based on renewable energy. And he said, this is a way to catapult ourselves and our country into the future.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have a chance to see some of these people in a minute, and I'm going to turn it over to Amelia now.
Yes, we will. But first, I want to tell everybody about, again, that 1 month free trial of the Christian Science Monitor Daily. The month-long trial provides you with the Monitor Daily newsletter, a set of hand-picked articles with in-depth stories from around the globe, just like the series, and delivered to your inbox every weekday evening. So if you want to try it out, you can go to csmonitor.com/free trial. And that's csmonitor.com/free trial. So the images, we all saw a number of your beautiful images rolling before we all started talking, and they are a crucial element of this amazing series. You shot the images for our stories in the Canadian Arctic, in Namibia, and in Bangladesh. So how did you approach this assignment?
Well, it's the same as with any story, but this time I got to go to these very exotic places. So I have to figure out how to tell the story visually. So I work very closely with the writer. We're a team. And once we figure out who our main people are, I'll go for a nice portrait of them. But best of all, I try to get them out doing their work. And we've been lucky enough to have that happen with these stories we've told. I also look for a sense of place. Let's show their environment, their country, or their home, so you can see what they're about. And then lastly, I'll look for detail shots, up-close things of something that'll help tell you who they are.
Well, speaking of a sense of place, you went to the Arctic, a place very few of us probably will ever get to go. And that's a very challenging climate to work in, I would think. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
It is. We flew to an Inuit village of about 1,000 people. The only way to get there is to fly in. It's the northernmost hamlet in mainland Canada. And this was in the summer, so there were 24 hours of daylight, which was great because it was nice directional light, which photographers love. And we hoped the people would be okay with being photographed. But you're never sure if you're in a new place if they're going to be okay with the camera. And luckily for me, they were great about it. They let me do candid shots. They didn't stare at me or get upset. So we were focusing on these young youth guardians, these teens who are learning how to hunt and fish with their elders, and using modern technology to measure the thickness of the ice and water quality. And we had some harrowing experiences going out on ATVs, either on the land or especially on the Arctic Ocean. We went 4 miles out on the Arctic Ocean on an ATV. And there were big puddles that looked like you were going to go right to the bottom of the ocean. But luckily, that didn't happen.
Well, we're very glad about that. Yeah, that sounds amazing. Now, you had the opposite challenge in Namibia. A desert atmosphere, completely different landscape. What was that like?
Well, we went from one of the coldest places on Earth to one of the driest. And there we met Dion, who you've heard about already, a very talkative and charismatic guy. He would talk to anybody about climate change and try to convert them to becoming activists. I took portraits of him, and we were lucky that he had an event coming up at an informal settlement with some teenagers who gave up their Saturdays to come and listen to talk about climate change and becoming climate activists and green hydrogen, which we still don't quite understand ourselves. But I was pleased to find that, again, everybody was super comfortable with my camera and very welcoming. And afterwards, Dion invited us home with him, which is such an honor to go to someone's private space. And as Sara said, it was a very small space that he shared with his mom. He used a sheet as a curtain so he'd have some privacy. He had his one suit hanging on a string from the ceiling, and that's the suit he wears to all these climate conferences he goes to all over the world, and he makes no money. He also had a lot of New York Yankee baseball hats.
Did he explain that
Like a
interest,
bag
or
full of them.
Yeah,
how did he become so fond of New
I'm
York
not
Yankees?
sure. Do you know, Sara? I don't know.
I actually don't know, but he literally had a bag full
Yeah,
bag full of
many
them.
colors.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. And now we'll go to questions from our Facebook audience. And Stephanie, we'll start with you. One of your stories was in Montana, where kids were using the state constitution to protect their environmental rights. Why isn't that happening in other states?
Well, it is happening in other states in the sense that there are other children's lawsuits that are underway. None of them have gotten yet to the trial phase. The more specific question, or the answer to that question, is that Montana has a unique constitution that guarantees the right to a healthy environment for current and future generations. So that's baked into that state's legal system. That said, there are other states that have that, and there are lawsuits underway in those states, and there are also other legal approaches going on elsewhere. But that was just the first one to go to trial.
Okay, thanks. This is for you or Sara. How are young climate workers networking to affect change in their countries? Is there any international system for them to collaborate?
Well, that's a great question. We were in Turkey, Mel and I, we were covering the aftermath of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. And in Istanbul, we met with a climate activist who was bringing a lawsuit against Turkey. And at that point, the project, I'm not even sure it had been officially greenlit, but we had it on our minds and we didn't know exactly where we were going to go. And we asked, we told him, oh, we're thinking about maybe going to Namibia. And he said, oh my gosh, if you go to Namibia, you have to meet Mama Ina. She's this, older young climate activist who has mentored all of these climate activists, in the COP space. And we said, okay. And then we get to Namibia and we met Mama Ina and we met Jakapita, and we were really hoping to go to Bangladesh, but it's very difficult to get into Bangladesh as a visa with, a journalist visa to go there. But Jakapita said, oh, if you go, you have to meet Farzana. She's my bestie. And so we realized there is this circle, especially of activists. A lot of them are active through Fridays for Future. And they meet each other at COP and they share ideas, and there is a ton of networking going on.
Great. All right, we have another question. Some people say climate change is overblown. Some say it isn't talked about enough. What are your thoughts based on your reporting?
I'll let our climate reporter answer that.
Well, I'm the climate reporter, so I think we should be writing and talking about it all the time.
All the time, yeah.
But I think there are. It's a really good question, actually, because we know that the world's getting hotter, and we know that it's because of human activity. The scientists are completely in agreement on that, and beyond that. There are some really good scientific models that predict the harm that could come from warming. And then there are some studies that question how we're going to adapt. And the thing that most scientists will say is that one of the big question marks about this is human behavior. They can model physical, environmental systems a lot better than they can predict what people are going to do. And so I think it's whether one goes from a extremely worried perspective or a less worried perspective, I think having conversations about it and going into these stories in the way that an organization like the Monitor can do is always helpful, because it's a conversation that we absolutely need to keep having.
All right, well, here's another one for both or either of you, and this goes to a point you made earlier, Clara, in your comments, in terms of how we framed this series. It's great to see these small solutions in different parts of the world, but why aren't you going after the multinational companies that are at the root of rising CO2 levels?
I mean, I'll answer that. It was just in the framework of this series. I mean, there's so many different things that we could write about in every single country related to climate change. But what we really wanted to do was focus on a generation and on their agency and what they can do, with the world as it is right now. And a lot of these kids and young people are fighting, national corporations, and they are creating their own companies to counter the problem. But, this was a piece looking at young people and their hope and their resilience.
And I'll actually piggyback on that a little bit. I think another from the climate science world, there's a certain amount of warming that's now baked into the system. Like, even if we eliminated fossil fuel and other greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, the Earth's going to continue to get hotter. So these big questions about what do we do? Is that something that sends us all scrambling and alarmed and doomeristic, or are there ways of approaching it that are more creative, that are more hopeful, that are going to lead the world into a better place? And so even putting aside that question of fossil fuel companies and multinationals that are potentially part of the problem, there's still a really important set of reporting and conversation to be had about, well, what do we do now?
And I want to say, Stephanie and I were constantly talking, and these initiatives seem very small, and in some ways they are, but Stephanie always said, but these kids are tackling these huge systems. Like, we're talking about our food and our energy, and it's not just these little dinky initiatives. It's part of a major system change that's going on.
That is really an interesting observation. We have a question from Patty, an audience member, who asks, what could we do to support the efforts of the man, Dion, who lives in the basement with his mom?
Clara, can I let you answer that?
Can we? We have some inspired readers who actually started an Kickstarter campaign for him to help give him some support. And there is that. That's completely at the readers' initiative. And so people are contributing to that.
And Patty, you are not alone, because I have gotten about a half a dozen emails from people asking how to support his efforts. So it's a thing. You can Google his name, Dion Shakuza.
Do you want to just spell the name real quick, in case anybody is interested?
S-H-E.
Well, first you should read the article, but if not, it's S-H-E.
They probably already have. Yeah.
K-U-Z-A.
Okay. All right. Here's another question. Did COP28 really accomplish anything?
Ooh. I think that's probably a me question. I don't know how to answer that. I think that what I would say from the reporting that I've done is that there are some people who believe that the practice of so many different people and activists and industry and politicians and different sectors all getting together, and the international community getting together to continue to discuss and try to build frameworks around climate change is really important and accomplishes things. Certainly, there are people who are also disappointed that these conferences haven't gone farther and haven't resulted in more dramatic action. And there are questions that I'm sure this participant perhaps knows about the fossil fuel industry's influence in these conferences at this point. So I would say there's a question mark there. I certainly don't have the answer for my reporting. Different people have different opinions.
I will just add that during COP28, I was following lots of climate activists from Bangladesh from my trip there. And there was tons of excitement because of the Loss and Damage Fund, which is this idea of richer countries providing money to poorer countries because of rich countries' behavior that puts poorer countries on the front lines of climate change. So that was a really important thing, I think, that came out of it.
And one other thing that's a little bit tangential, just to keep going on that, Sarah's mentioning the activists that she heard from Bangladesh. Some of the people that I interviewed from Barbados were there, and even outside of the policy recommendations that come from these conferences, these are a place where these people from different parts of the world can meet and exchange ideas. And for the younger climate generation that we were reporting about, at least the activist segment of this generation, that contact is really important.
Well, here's another impact-related question, probably for you, Stephanie. Did the Montana ruling have any practical effect?
That's not. These are good questions. Yes, it does have a practical effect. Again, what the extent of that effect of that particular lawsuit on practices in Montana today, that's something that people can talk about, because really the specifics of that lawsuit were about whether the state violated young people's constitutional rights by not considering the climate impacts of energy decisions. And so that's going to have to change. And as people who cover politics probably could say better than there are often workarounds. But you had climate science going into a U.S. courthouse and being found to be valid. And that was one of the first times in the U.S. that that's happened. And you have a lot of conversation about climate science in social media and on talk shows. And very rarely is it held up, or the denial side of it held up, to legal system scrutiny. And that happened, and a judge ruled that the legal system and the judiciary should be involved in this question. And it was a matter of young people's rights. So all of those aspects of that case will be used in future cases and may well have a really huge impact as things move forward.
Thanks. And now we have a question from Joan. How important is social media in being able to make these connections and further these efforts? What social media formats in particular do these young people use?
I think social media is everything. And I think they use everything. Maybe not Facebook, but no, they do use Facebook, but everything. And WhatsApp is just huge. I mean, WhatsApp numbers are just shared all over the place.
Okay. Clara, here's another. I'm going to circle back to you for a minute. I know there were a lot of behind-the-scenes challenges. Things that readers, when they see a story all neatly packaged at the end, have no idea happened. And can you share some of those, or ask these all?
There's always drama. But I'm this editor sitting at my little control post and, taking in information and stories and things that come from them and the reporters' excitement and all of that. One particular reporter on the job thing was the wardrobe drama of going from the Arctic to a place like Bangladesh. I don't know if Melanie wants to address that.
Yeah, wardrobe. Well, we were in the Arctic in the summer, but it wasn't that warm. And Sara and I thought we had the right outfits. We had our coats. I didn't have boots that were warm enough. We ended up having to borrow parkas with big fur collars and these huge heavy boots because we were out all day. So even if it was maybe 30 degrees, if you're out all day, you have to have these really warm outfits. Bangladesh was the opposite. It was so hot and humid. It was like walking into a steam bath. It's very difficult. And my cameras, I would be going out of an air-conditioned car out into this steamy environment, and my lenses would fog up, and they wouldn't clear for sometimes 15 minutes. Meanwhile, whatever I was hoping to photograph isn't happening anymore. So, yeah, very challenging.
And maybe Sara could talk about the cliffhanger visa issue.
Oh, yes. So I was saying earlier how we didn't know if we were going to go to Bangladesh. Well, it turns out we didn't know if we were going to Bangladesh 5 days before we were supposed to go to Bangladesh. So it was real. We had these production deadlines because it was a series. We were locked in. And so I actually had a Plan B trip to Thailand planned because I was pretty sure I wasn't going to get the visa to Bangladesh. And we finally got it only because Mel had gotten hers from the US, and the ambassador was a huge fan of UNICEF, who supported our visas to Bangladesh and trusted the Christian Science Monitor to tell the story. And I still wasn't getting my visa. And Clara says, just go talk to them in person and see if Milton, that's the guy in
Yeah, Milton's our hero.
And I'm thinking, oh my God, Clara, that is not going to help. But I'm like, okay, I'm going to listen to her. Well, Milton did help. He called Canada, and I got my visa issued. So it was drama till the end and throughout.
That's right.
Yeah.
Could I make a correction really quickly?
Yes, please.
I earlier about Dion, I said it was a Kickstarter campaign. It's a GoFundMe, just FYI.
Okay, well, thank you. It's always really interesting to hear the behind the scenes stuff and then to see the amazing result. And I will just say, having watched all of this and talked to everybody throughout the process, all four of you, yes, the cliffhangers, the patience, the incredible logistics, as well as reporting skill, interviewing skill, caring, all that kind of thing, choosing the right image, it really takes so much to put a story and images together. And with that, we'll end this special event with a thanks to our guests, Clara Germani, Climate Generation Series Editor, Stephanie Haynes, the Monitor's environmental reporter, Sara Miller Llana, our Canada Bureau Chief, and staff photographer Melanie Stetson Freeman. If you missed some of the conversation or just want to view it again, send us an email. The email is events@csmonitor.com. That's events@csmonitor.com, and we'll let you know when the recording is available on YouTube. And I'll just remind you one more time that you can get a 1-month free trial to the Monitor at csmonitor.com/free trial. And I'd also like to thank the people behind the scenes for this event. Again, we're grateful to the Pulitzer Center for their support of the Climate Generation series. Our events team is led by Promotion and Events Manager Lauren Crandall and Associate Product Manager Casey Fetty. Greg Fitzgerald produced our event with support from Mandy K. Paycheck, Cortland Reekston, Sophie Foti, and Emily Staunton. Our studio crew included Ian Blacquier, who's Technical Director, Vincent Lomascolo, Director, Morgan Anderson, Producer, and Jeff Turton, Audio Engineer. And I'm Managing Editor Amelia Newcomb. Thank you so much for joining us.